So we're talking about business continuity during a pandemic such as COVID-19. And I've got two experts on this specific topic with us here today. I've got Rahul and Ralph from Deloitte. So Rahul and then Ralph, I'd like you to both introduce yourselves, your title, what you do at Deloitte, and then for us to really just jump into business continuity during COVID-19.
Thanks, John. So I'll go first. This is Rahul Mahendale. I'm an MD at Deloitte, and I lead the Future of Health charge, where we've been looking at how the trajectory could change along the future of health and what we need to do so that we prepare and accelerate for the change that's expected. Prior to that, I've been a serial entrepreneur. More recently, I exited out of a company that I founded and ran for 12 years called MySkin, which is the world's first company that quantified skin health.
All right, so Ralph Judah, I'm a senior managing director at Deloitte in our Los Angeles office. I lead healthcare strategy at Deloitte globally. Spend most of my time working for providers, health plans, and life sciences companies, helping them deal with the reality which they confront, which of course today involves massive business continuity issues and risks that we'll be spending some time covering.
So the first question I have for both of you is, how will business operations change during what we're going through with COVID-19?
Rahul, do you want to?
Maybe Ralph, I can jump in.
Please do.
And then we can build off there. But I think business operations, what we are seeing is COVID-19 has created a situation where the future of health is not just at our door, it's actually in our house. So what do I mean by that? So when we look at business operations and specifically in response to a crisis, a lot of the themes that we talked about, which would have been fairly forward-looking, in the sense, I was with an executive at a private equity fund, and we talked about some of these themes such as telemedicine or remote working, testing at home, using AI for drug discovery, testing through different sites of cares or getting care at different locations. So all these themes at one point, which wasn't that long ago, about two months ago, were considered to be what I would say 5 or 7 years out. And look at what this crisis has done. This crisis has actually brought these themes to be implemented and these business operations to be changed across the spectrum today. And I think whether it's all these trends around using technology, how do we work from home, how do we stay at home, how do we quarantine ourselves at home, how do we build relationships remotely? I mean, all these issues have become front and center, which is why this crisis has brought the future not just to our doorstep, but it has actually entered our house.
So
I don't know what your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I would add simply this. At a macro level, what we're dealing with is a massive disconnect between the supply and the demand of a range of products, health and otherwise. There's been a massive spike in demand for a particular kind of healthcare and a system that is inflexible and has been substantially unable to respond in real time to the demand surge that coronavirus 19 has driven. At the same time, you've seen in the grocery business and in the supply business, as the supply of hand sanitizers and masks and so on, a massive disconnect between steady state supply and surge demand. So the entire economy is actually dealing with what is both a period discontinuity, but may also be the new normal, because anybody who suggests that this pandemic is the last pandemic we're going to have hasn't spent any time with the with an epidemiologist lately, because they will tell you that the cycle time for virus mutation has now shifted from 200 years ago, it was 100 years for a virus to mutate, to the extent that we've seen SARS mutate into COVID. The current cycle time, they're saying, is now 3 years, which means, and I'm really happy to bring you this news on this webcast, the next time we're going to confront a pandemic risk like this is about 3 years from now. So this calls for a massive reconfiguration of supply chains. It calls for a massive rethink of things as simple as buffer inventories throughout the healthcare system. There are none. There have been none, and it's reasonably clear. We now need to start processing all of that.
And then Ralph, maybe, just picking up on that, I think we are also taking, of course, both of us are in the healthcare world, so we are taking the healthcare centric angle. But one of the things you have brought up in the past, which is really interesting, is the fact that we are talking about the health crisis, but we are still what I would call on chapter 1 of the health crisis, and this is to be followed by an economic crisis. So there are the business implications are not just from the healthcare lens, but we also have to now start thinking about how our business is going to respond from an economic lens, right? I think you've been a big proponent of that view.
Yes, no, this is an impulse to begin doing a major economic restructuring. That's why we're headed into what will undoubtedly be a vicious recession. And I beg to differ from our fearless leader in the US, who suggests that it's going to be business as usual by Easter. I think it's going to be crisis as usual by Easter. And in fact, until we go through a very painful economic restructuring, not unlike the restructuring of the financial sector that we saw in the US in 2008, until we go through that in any kind of material way, it's extremely important to recognize that we will be in this discontinuity. People will continue to be forced to stay at home. Social distancing will perpetuate. That has massive economic ramifications. So we're on the brink of a major sort of global economic restructuring. We're going to restructure relationships with other countries. We're going to restructure relationships between suburbs and cities. We're going to restructure relationships between physicians and their patients. Basically, everything has now been put into play. And this isn't a disaster scenario. It's just a restructuring scenario.
What does that really look like? If we look at real life examples of how working remotely is going to affect the economy, or what the disruption is going to be in healthcare, what are those real life examples so this can be real for people?
Right. Jonathan, I'll tell you that when I've repaired my relationship with my wife from staying home.
There needs to be a lot of marriage counseling going on, because I completely understand that.
Yes. But Rahul, perhaps you can take a more serious tilt at that one.
Sure. So I think I would just, before we jump straight into, how all this will change and the implications that are from remote working. Actually, the word crisis. I mean, when we look at the Latin root and we look at the Merriam-Webster's definition of the word crisis, its genesis is actually in the medical world. So crisis is technically defined as the turning point in an acute disease or fever. So I don't know if everybody knew that. And we got to understand what are the elements of that turning point, right? So there's an element of instability. There's an element where there's a lot of rapid change of information. There's an element where decisions need to be made in those vague environments. There is no such thing as perfect information to help you make a decision. And you'll hear me saying it again and again, which is you got to be decisive, and that's the part that defines the crisis. So I think as we start looking at information flows, as we start looking at decisions that need to be made, um, everything that we are doing in this situation, in this medical situation or in this health crisis, whereby we are now doing things like working from home. Uh, we are now doing things like for me, I have two girls, and the pediatric clinics have all shut down, and all they're doing is virtual visits. So kids get a cold, they cough. Here we are adopting virtual visits. I mean, that's what's happening in real time. There are things that all of us across the planet are doing at one time, which is washing our hands much better. Uh, there are things that we are doing where when our friends come in, we no longer hug. We're staying 6 feet away. We are not shaking hands. There are all these behavioral changes that are happening, not just from a work perspective, but which are also happening from a personal interaction perspective. So distancing, remote working, the tools that we are using to work, I mean, those are definitely the short-term immediate implications, or the outcomes, or the impact of this crisis and how we are trying to navigate it. And the reality is, I don't think that these changes are going to go away. I mean, I'll ask you, I've asked a lot of people out there, and I say, hey, okay, so if our president says, everything's fine and dandy, and on Easter, we got to go hang out, would you be comfortable? Would you be comfortable the next day washing your hands a little less, right? Or not washing them at all? I mean, would you be comfortable touching the ATM pads to withdraw money? I mean, just yesterday I went to the train station, and my wife freaked out. She's like, you can't touch the ATM pad. So again, this crisis has driven changes from a personal perspective, from a behavioral perspective, which impact not just what I said on the personal front, but also from a work standpoint. I mean, now we are trying to figure out how to communicate remotely. Here we are. You are in LA. Ralph is in LA. I'm here in New York. We're using GoToMeeting to do this conference, and we're going to have people who are probably going to be listening to this all over the world. I mean, millions of people are going to join in and listen to this remotely on their computers. I mean, this is very different from the fireside chat that we've typically had. And 2 months ago, if we would have talked about this, we would have probably said, this is not going to happen for another 3 to 5 years. So long story short, these are the changes which I feel which are happening already. And not only are these changes going to stay, but there are implications to these changes, which are going to accelerate this trend of what's come out of this crisis.
And John, I think about this as a fundamental shift in the givens. So one of the givens in life in the US, for example, is that people go out to eat on a routine basis, systematically. I think that those decisions are going to be taken much more carefully, and we're likely to see reduced restaurant traffic for a sustained period of time, and perhaps a material shift sort of back to the future towards people actually cooking in their homes and families having dinner together. That has massive implications for transportation and transportation networks. It has implications for logistics and logistics networks, for distribution systems, inventories within the system. So you can sort of, the ripples of these behavioral changes, which typically result from crises like this, are going to be extensive and substantial. A quick example in the real world. My clients basically, in a discussion yesterday with the chief strategy officers in 10 of the leading healthcare systems in the US, said to me that they do not believe that we will go back to business as usual practice in the clinical domain in their hospitals going into the future, that much more virtual and telemedicine and non-physical interaction will be taking place going forward than they were able to do historically. That implies a dramatic shift in the cost structure and the service delivery models, within all the hospitals in the US. So 20% of the economy is going to be drastically impacted, and has been very directly by this thus far. We're going to see that throughout the economy. We're going to see the same things happening in banking. We're going to see the same things happening across the retail domain. We're going to see identical things happening across consumer packaged goods, etc. I don't think there's a part of the economy that's going to be untouched here, and we need to be very, very thoughtful about what the future models are. And importantly, to come back to Rahul's point about data and analytics, clients are now talking to us about modeling, about the fact that all of their existing models, including their budget models, their capital allocation models, their compensation models, their human capital models, are sort of broken, and we need to fix them. Nobody seems to be able to model the trajectory of this virus with any kind of real predictability at the moment. All of these guys are struggling to come to grips with whether Seattle is at the top of the virus cycle, whether New York is going to be there in a couple of weeks' time, and if they're there, whether they'll sustain it. Fundamental issues like that, we're going to see all across retail. We're going to see in financial services. We're seeing it in the stock market. We're seeing a classic paroxysmic indecision. One day it's good, one day it's bad. They've all become completely manic because of the absence of predictability, and there is no precedent. And so models that are not scenario-based models are failing. So one of the things I think all of the listeners here need to be thinking about is you need scenario models in situations where events like this occur, where we're in nonlinear times, require nonlinear analysis. So think about that very carefully.
And Ralph, I think I loved what you talked about. When you pointed out the data and platform piece and modeling, and I love to defer or rely on our three business framework, right? When we look at especially on the future of health, right? What the three business archetypes that we look at. So broadly, I would just dive in a little bit deeper on what Ralph said and look at the entire landscape and ecosystem into three specific business areas, right? One is what we call data and platforms. So I think Ralph has very eloquently laid out the challenges of modeling and scenario analysis. How do we use data? How do we build platforms? How do we convene that data? Do we make it interoperable? What's the infrastructure implication? What's the implication for driving these science and insights? And they apply not just to health, but across the economic landscape. So I think data and platforms is one. The second is what I call the delivery space, right? So I think all the business models which are in that archetype, we start looking at things which are, for example, products. People who develop products, people who develop consumer-centric communities or virtual pieces. There are specialty operators of certain sorts. There are in the healthcare world there are localized health hubs. So there's a whole series of delivery pieces or business frameworks that exist there. And then the last part is the enablers, right? We have those people who connect. This is the supply chain networks that Ralph talked about. There are the financial networks that we are looking at. There's a the regulatory bodies which play a role in here. So these are all the enablers across these different archetypes and across the business landscape. So if you look at data and platforms, we look at the delivery and the product space, and we look at the enablers. I think those three sets of archetypes are going to go through radical, rampant change as we start looking at these future models that have now arrived at our doorstep.
So if we're moving to a virtual world, what does that mean for brick and mortar, whether it's healthcare or retail and things like that? Are there going to be a lot of people that end up losing their jobs? And is everything going to shift more to a digital world? And does that mean the people that used to be in the store or behind the computers, or they're delivering the goods? And is it, is this, as some people think, that, is this a 3-month thing, 6-month thing, or this is a total rethinking of how business is done going forward?
So I think it's a total rethink, but let's think about this, because we've got some very recent examples in retail. So think about Walmart versus Amazon. So Amazon showed up and everybody said, oh, it's the death of Walmart. Well, guess what? It isn't. It hasn't been. What it has demonstrated, however, is that new paradigms of scale matter in retail. And I think the same is going to apply generally. Walmart has massive scale. And actually, it is almost, you cannot defend against the degree of scale that they've built in that business. They are doing just fine in the face of Amazon's penetration into retail. Others have not been so lucky. And we've seen, Sears and Kmart and an array of other players, sort of slouching very, very slowly towards Bethlehem, effectively phasing out. We're going to see the same kinds of phase outs, but it's not brick and mortar versus virtual. It is people who bring integrated business models at scale to the table who really are going to thrive in this new normal. And otherwise, it's going to be people who bring very targeted offerings to specific groups of consumers. So think about the sort of Main Street or high street retail is basically in deep trouble, but Target is going to survive, Kohl's may survive, etc. It isn't an either or. It is back to fundamental questions about strategy and a capacity to bring or borrow scale to enable the new economics.
I think just building on that, Ralph, on the 10th strategy, that's the chief strategy officer call, I think one of my key takeaways was something very similar, right? Which is 3 months ago, to them, features mattered. Today, they don't even want to have a discussion on features. It's all about scale. I mean, look at the narrative and the discussion that's happening. It's all about how do we scale testing, how do we scale data collection, how do we scale protecting our most vulnerable, how do we scale a whole series of different solutions, and we are talking about scaling those not just internally within the US but globally, right? I mean, this is not an issue. It's funny, we are socially distant, but never have we been closer as a world. So it's really interesting as to what's happening from that perspective. And I completely agree with Ralph. I mean, this is a complete reset. I mean, this is we got to rethink, reimagine a new world. As I mentioned earlier, it's not like our behaviors are going to change and we're going to go back to what we were doing. In this case, whether people are going to get back on flights. I mean, are corporates going to be doing more remote working or remote meetings? I mean, things like conferences. Are we going to go for these conferences, or are conferences going to fall down? I mean, or go down in terms of attracting the number of people that they normally attract. I mean, I think over the next few years, this is definitely a complete reset. And we got to think through this phase, because right now we are still what I call in the respond step. So I think we have now started looking, we are moving. I think of it in 3 steps: respond, recover, and then thrive. And we are still in that respond phase, and we have kind of started thinking and talking about recovery. Okay, what will happen? How will businesses adapt, change, adopt new processes, so on and so forth. And we haven't even touched the realm of how we are going to then thrive in that new world, right? The reimagined world that Ralph has brought up. I think we really have to frame where we are today from that respond perspective and start thinking about recovery. But we cannot. But we have to prepare for thriving in that new world. So again, I agree with Ralph. I think interesting times.
So Jonathan, let me just bring us back to strategy for survival and thriving in this environment. I touched on the issue of scale as a strategy, and I spoke a little bit about focus. In the language of strategy, you're dealing with scale versus scope. So if you scope your business in a fashion that addresses a carefully selected segment of the population in ways that they particularly want to be addressed, you're going to be able to thrive. If you're able to achieve scale or borrow or buy scale in a business, you're going to be able to thrive. If you aren't making one of those decisions, you're going to find yourself in some level of trouble. So high-end eateries ultimately will survive. So the sort of middle of the road eateries, not so much. Fast foods, yes, because they're operating at scale. So, you know, the same with banks. There are 3 or 4 or 5 banks that too big to fail banks. And then there are a bunch of other smaller banks that are a little more targeted, a little more focused, and most of the others have been eaten. I think this is going to accelerate that kind of choice in ways that hasn't been nearly as urgent before. So the future is rushing towards us now. As Rahul said earlier, we can't just sort of wait for it to happen. It's rushing at us, and critical strategic decisions are going to need to be made by all business owners.
And with those decisions, I think you were saying it, Rahul, before, like people are going to be faced with very hard decisions that they have never had to deal with before. And they're just going to have to make judgment calls, but they have to make a decision, right? You know, we had a national retail store call us, you know, to say, you know, we want to purchase thermometers for all of our stores around the country. And we want to test employees to make sure that they're not coming in and they have a fever or sick. And we're wondering whether we should do customers too, but we're concerned because this might violate a law from the EEOC, but we've never dealt with a scenario of this before and nothing dictates this. Do we do what we feel is right to protect people and potentially get sued? Like, what do we do? And I think that the challenge is the indecision.
Yes.
Yes. And I like to, I think you're spot on. I always like to look at it from the framework, you know, as a consultant, you know, I like 2x2s, right? So we got to think in terms of the consequence versus the likelihood, right? So if you look at consequence, and if the consequence is low, likelihood is low, or consequence meaning impact, you know, let's generalize it and say number of people, right? So the consequence is a limited impact, low likelihood, we can forget about it. You know, if the consequence is again, very limited impact on people, even if the likelihood is high, it's still, you know, I think we can still respond to it when the crisis hits, right, and make certain decisions. If the consequence is low, but the likelihood is high, again, we can, you know, kind of forget about it. We are in a situation where we have a consequence which is very high, and the likelihood is very low, right? So this is exactly the challenge of what we are going through right now, and this is where leadership responsibility really comes in, because you know, the likelihood of COVID-19 was very low, right? Because the consequence is tremendously high, right? We are looking at a global pandemic. Climate change would potentially be the same thing. The likelihood could be very low, but the consequence would be disastrous, right? So, I mean, there are elements that I think we all need to pause and say, hey, wait a minute. We have learned our lesson, and now if you look through the consequence and the likelihood lens, we got to treat all these things in a slightly different way. We got to treat these things in a different way in terms of using the data to drive certain decisions. And as John, as you pointed out, to make rapid decisions. And the leadership responsibility here is key, because this is what I call the Stockdale paradox. So Stockdale was a naval officer in Vietnam, and you know, he was captured. Is a very high-ranking naval officer. He was captured and put in prison for 7 years. You know, tortured regularly, so on and so forth. But he made it out okay, right? And when he was asked how did he do that, he said he balanced realism with optimism. So the leadership responsibility in driving decisions at this stage is how do you embrace honest truth with still creating hope And the honest truth, which is, you're seeing people die, blah, blah, blah. You still have to, you have to embrace that and be transparent and communicate it, and at the same time build hope, right? And these two inherently make it a paradox. So leadership responsibility, again, is navigating through the Stockdale paradox, communicating honest truth, but still building hope, and acting quickly in times when information is vague and yet decisions need to be made fast, right? So, and just, maybe, and I came back to Deloitte recently, so I'm not, I still take a very independent view, but I do feel like, especially Deloitte in this case, the way they responded very early on has been phenomenal. I mean, I'm extremely impressed by the leadership. They stopped all internal travels right in the first week of March when people were still scratching their heads. They stopped all external travels right away. They empowered every employee. Imagine doing that for 150,000 plus employees. They told every employee that, listen, if you are not comfortable going to a client site, you're not going comfortable, doing anything, don't do it. You are empowered. Nobody's going to go after you. None of that, right? So leadership, they took decisions which were stringent. They empowered employees, but more importantly, every day we have a leadership update where the leadership is on video chat, and you have thousands of people logging in every day. There's an update. Hey, this is what happened from a business perspective, and again, it's that Stockdale paradox. I can see the leaders communicating the impact to business, but at the same time, building hope. They have always said that, listen, Deloitte has been around for 175 years, and we have gone through multiple crises, and this is another one. We've gone through 9/11, we've gone through 2008, we've gone through .com. These are the lessons that we have learned. This is how we will act, and people may not like it, they may not agree with it, but it's important to build hope. And I think that's one of the things I feel is important. I mean, this is a leadership challenge, and the leaders have to step up and lead.
Yeah, Rahul, you just triggered an important lesson that I learned in history. So in 1993, I was the African National Congress in exile. Mandela had just been released. They reached out to me to come back to South Africa, which is my native land, and act as a supporter and driver of policy for the African National Congress. I became a special advisor to cabinet, worked very closely with Nelson Mandela, which was a great privilege and one of the highlights of my life. But what I learned from him about decision making under uncertainty and leadership and hope was it was not obvious that there was going to be a peaceful resolution to the fall of apartheid in South Africa. In fact, there was a low-level civil war going on up until the time of the election. He came in with enormous certainty, and in the very first meeting that I had with him, just after his release from prison, he said to me, look, we're going to win the election. It's virtually certain. I want you to immediately start working on restructuring the transport system, restructuring the health system, renegotiating the agreements on general trade and tariff with the international community, reaching out to the Clinton administration to begin to secure American support for where we're going. And importantly, I want you to reach out to white business in South Africa so that you act as an intermediary between people whom they think are communists, not particularly helpful, and the existing vested business interests. And this was 18 months before he was actually formally elected. He was already positioned in the future, making decisions around belief and hope at a time when a civil war was beginning to rage and there was the depths of despair and uncertainty in the economy overall. So this is the lesson of great leadership, and it's the kind of leadership we need to see now. I think it's the kind of thing you're seeing from Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Health right now. He conveys certainty, he conveys hope, he conveys a scientific orientation and a clarity and an integrity that is the most important element now of leadership in a crisis. I think we're witnessing something historic in this regard.
And I think we should also learn from, what I would call inaction, right? I mean, when we look at Italy, I really feel Italy and Spain had a little bit of inaction, right? So, and there's a story about I don't know if you've heard of the Buridan's ass, right? So there's this ass or a donkey which is really hungry, and then it has hungry and thirsty, right? And it's got food on one side and it's got a can of water on the other side. And the ass stands in the middle, looking, should I drink first or should I eat first? Should I drink first? Should I eat first? And the indecision leads him to starve and die, right? And this is exactly where leadership responsibility comes into play, right? You're not going to have perfect information. You've got to make a call, but you've got to take a big call, and you've got to look at whether you're going to first eat so that you survive, and then drink a little bit of water. But you've got to act. Not acting can lead to, as this crisis has shown, a real loss of life.
Mm-hmm. And so I think the implication is shifting back into thinking like a mission-driven organization is where many of your folks need to go at times of uncertainty like this. This is about values and beliefs and the ongoing transmission of those into your business model.
No, I agree. I think it's very important that it's a time where I think a lot of people may be afraid to make decisions or not know what the right decision is, but you've got to have the vision and you just have to make decisions because there's no one else that's going to make it for you.
That's exactly. Well, you could hire consultants like us, I suppose, but that's a default.
Yes. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on and sharing your insights. I think it's going to be a very interesting road. We had very uncharted waters, and there will be a lot of decisions that have to be made on an ongoing basis. It's something new, and I think the thinking of how we do business, how we think about business, even strategy, it's all going to change. And we're gonna come out stronger and better than we were before. It's going to be tough, but that optimism is extremely important, because without the optimism, you won't see the solutions, you won't see the right answers, and it's easy to get stuck in the negative and the lack of indecision. But this is a moment of time for those things. So thank you very much.